Okay, thank you, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our inaugural Anti-Racism Speaker Series for the Center for Research on People of Color here at the Columbia University School of Nursing. We are very proud and honored to have Dr. Anna Branch, who is the Senior Vice President of Equity at Rutgers University. And we're happy to have, she's going to talk to us today about her most recent book, Black in America, which was published this year in 2020. But prior to getting started, I just want to read the Columbia School of Nursing Land Acknowledgement Statement. We acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Lenape people on which we learn, work, and gather today at Columbia University School of Nursing. Lenape means real person or original person, and it is important to remember that Lenape collectively are a living and breathing community. Let us honor their legacy. Let us commit ourselves to the struggle against the forces that have disposed the Lenape and other indigenous people of their lands. We stand strong in our commitment to support and defend all marginalized people of this land who have been stripped of their rights to self-determination. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Vivian Taylor, who will introduce our speaker. And for those of you who may come on late, this will be recorded and will be available at a later time for you to view at your leisure. And for students who are on the call, if you would like to obtain a copy of Dr. Branch's book, please contact us at the Center for Research on People of Color, and we will make sure that you have a copy. Okay, Dr. Taylor, please take it away.
Yes, I am extremely pleased to welcome Dr. Enobong Anna Branch, who is the Senior Vice President for Equity and provides strategic leadership to promote equity and inclusion in every aspect of the university. She coordinates university-wide efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion involving faculty, staff, and students, and ensures that the institutional commitment to equity is reflected in the research, educational, and public engagement efforts that occur throughout the university. Dr. Branch oversees the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement on the New Brunswick campus, championing the role of diversity and inclusion in achieving excellence and strengthening the institutional commitment to its diverse community on and off the campus. Prior to joining Rutgers University, Dr. Branch served as Associate Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer, and a Professor of Sociology at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her significant accomplishments in that role included leading the integration of diversity throughout the campus's strategic plan, executing the university's campus climate survey, and creating diversity infrastructure through climate advisors and in executive areas, and diversity officers in schools and colleges. Wow. A professor of sociology, Dr. Branch conducts research on labor and work that explores the historical roots and contemporary underpinnings of racial and gender inequality. She is the co-author of the new book that we've been reading, Black in America, The Paradox of the Color Line. The editors of Pathway, Potholes, and the Persistence of Women in Science. Reconsidering the Pipeline, she also wrote, and the author of Opportunity Denied, Limiting Black Women to Devalued Work. Dr. Branch received her PhD in sociology from the University at Albany, SUNY, and her BS in biology from Howard University. Truly, we've got an outstanding scholar here in our midst. I introduce to some and present to others, none other than Dr. Anna Branch.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to meet you all, spend some time. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Dr. Jacqueline Taylor, for the invitation. And thank you, Ms. Prescott, for all of the work you've done to get me here and get this talk on. So I'm so delighted to be with you, and I want to congratulate the Center for Research on People of Color at the Columbia School of Nursing. And I'm just delighted to kick off this conversation with you with what I hope is going to be a purposefully thought-provoking conversation around the role of medicine and health in the struggle for equality. So let's get started, and I make sure that there's going to be some time for questions. So I'm going to go right into my screen share and make sure that you can see my slides. Are we good? Yes? Awesome. Wonderful. All right, so the title of today's talk is First Do No Harm: Eugenics, Medicine, and Devaluing Black Life. And first do no harm, even if you have never taken a medical class or something you've heard before, right? The idea, right, that you should first do no harm. There was a really interesting Harvard blog about 5 years ago that kind of made the point that that's not an actual thing, right? It's actually not a part of the Hippocratic Oath, but it's something that we understand, right? To first do no harm. So I want to take you through the kind of contradictions that has presented in the way that medicine and the kind of work around health and health equity has not always been, has kept that promise for Blacks and Black life. So quick outline, I talk fast, I want you to know where we're going. We'll start with the color line. What is it? Let's talk about that kind of as a foundational idea. I want to talk to you about racial frames to give you some sociological grounding, because I'm out of my element today, and I'm excited about that. And then we're going to talk about racism and the medical establishment, right? And I'm going to offer you some examples of the way that's played out historically. And then value and disdain in Black life and really the consequences for our present moment. So stick with me and let's dive right in. So the problem of the century, W.E.B. Du Bois declared, was the problem of the color line, right? And anyone who is paying attention in America today can see that this is a challenge that is with us. And one of the points that was made here, this is one of his defining works, The Souls of Black Folks, and he opened it with this conviction and certainty. And for us, well into the 21st century, the problem remains. Now, while the color line itself is increasingly variegated as more racial and ethnic groups call America home, Black Americans retain an unwelcome distinction as America's problem. The challenge, though, for many is how can we talk about the color line as the problem if there's evidence of Black success all around, right? And that the example for many is Black success negates that truth. How can the color line be the problem? And for a moment, at the start of the 21st century, with the election of President Barack Obama, words like post-racial and colorblind overtook our lexicon, and for a moment, drowned out words like racism and discrimination, hiding, if only temporarily, the inconvenience of deep racial disparity. And this is the quintessential American paradox. Our embrace of the ideals of meritocracy and America as the land of opportunity, despite systemic racial advantages and disadvantages accrued across generations that have denied this opportunity to Black people. To be Black in America is to exist among a myriad of contradictions: racial progress and regression, abject poverty amidst profound wealth, discriminatory policing, yet equal protection under the law. And the desire to focus on race less avoids the discomfort of this reality. So those are some of kind of our background foundational challenges. Ooh, I skipped a slide, or I switched around. I want to talk to you about now controlling images, and I want to think about racial frames and controlling images together. But racial frames are ways that structure how we understand and under the world around us. And increasingly, there is a dominant racial frame that makes race the problem. An extension of that racial frame is the idea of controlling images offered by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins. And what she argues in the case of Black women in particular, it's a generalized ideology of domination. Stereotypical images of Black womanhood take on special meaning. And these images are designed to make racism, sexism, poverty, and other forms of social injustice appear to be natural, normal, and inevitable parts of everyday life. It's an outcome of a racial frame. When we think about the present and going forward, the push that Black Lives Matter exemplifies, the call to transform society, it's a powerful reminder of structural violence. And while it seems unsettling to some Americans, and it seems obvious to others to state that Black lives matter, the tension that underlies the resistance is, well, of course Black lives matter. And really, all lives matter. Minus a few tragedies, horrible misunderstandings between police and Black men and women, we can all agree that all lives matter and not just Black lives. And this point of view is not uncommon. It's a point of discussion in many dining rooms, college classrooms, and especially police stations. But perhaps a simpler question that I want to spend some time on today is, whose life has mattered historically? For whom has America signaled value and or tolerated disdain? And in the historical frame, most would agree that Blacks were not valued. But many would argue that the issues today are more of an aberration. And so to make this issue less black and white, pun intended, let's first examine a seemingly less charged issue, medical care. So I want to start out with a discussion of eugenics. So this image, I want you to pause and kind of look closely at for a moment. Eugenics is the founding tree, and in the words on the sides, our eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. And in the roots of the tree, you see the names of many, many disciplines: anatomy, physiology, biology, genetics, mental testing, history, geology, anthropology, law, statistics, politics, sociology, medicine, surgery, psychiatry. No field was exempt. We all disciplinarily participated in the push for eugenics. And the push for eugenics, I'm going to argue for you over this talk, was not race neutral. It was race explicit. And the devaluation of Blacks in the US is exemplified in the historical treatment of Black bodies. As the 20th century dawned, so did this fledgling eugenics movement. And it was a movement aimed at mitigating social ills, like crime and poverty and immoral acts like promiscuity, through selective breeding. Foundational to eugenics was a supposition that those ills are genetic in nature and can be bred in and out of a population in the same way that eye or hair color can. And again, you might pause now with our 21st century understanding and say, that's ludicrous, right? Who would believe that? Everyone. And so I want to start in taking you all the way back in time. President Wilson, and this is Woodrow Wilson's private secretary, is not an advocate of race suicide, the headline read. Race suicide was an alarmist term used in eugenics, and it was coined by a sociologist, Edward A. Ross. And part of the conversation around race suicide was the differential birth rate between those who were fit or best, which was code very explicitly for white, wealthy, educated, and Protestant, and the unfit or undesirable, who were coded quite explicitly as poor, uneducated, criminals, diseased, mental and physical defectives, and ethnic, racial, and religious minorities. Again, a comprehensiveness to that list. And you might say, oh, that was just the private secretary to the president. Well, that also, the piece of this that extended further was a concern that these groups of unfits were a challenge for American society because the unfit would override the fit, that they would dwindle those who were fit to the point of extinction. And this idea became so popular that it was espoused by the president himself. President Theodore Roosevelt said, society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their kind. Leading US figures, including then President Theodore Roosevelt, warned that unless white families did their patriotic duty and bore children at rates sufficient to outpace non-whites, the US would lose its distinctly American culture. This next image could be found in American society quite commonly. And the words say, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. So these were very popular. And again, there was this tension, right, in America between the embrace of the ideas of eugenicism. But again, they were not mocked as widely as we might want to believe right now. Numerous states enacted policies allowing state or local governments the discretion to surgically sterilize any resident who was deemed unfit to reproduce, with these policies predictably targeting Black populations. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of these policies in the 1927 Buck versus Bell decision, and thus Black bodies, current and future, were now at the mercy of local and state officials, with the supposed moral infractions often being sufficient grounds for sterilization. And this push against sterilization came to be known or titled by Jones and Seabrook as the new Jane Crow, the massive assault on Black women's bodies to highlight the lack of discourse and kind of historical trajectory of the oppression of Black women in particular. And there were many reasons for their sterilizations, including population control as connected to stereotypes of Black motherhood, US welfare discourse, as well as practice for medical students at local universities. US doctors routinely refused to deliver the babies of Black women and Medicaid recipients who had already born 2 or more children unless they consented to sterilization. Whereas under a concurrent practice, white and middle-class mothers who had not had, in quotes, enough children were refused sterilization. So this discussion and this image that you see of a protest, right, for the sterilization of Black mothers features Black and white women in conversation over whether or not they had control over their bodies. And here they're referencing the UN as an external appeal for women's right over their own reproductive health. This came to a head in 1973. Black women only received legal protection from coercive sterilization after the fallout resulting from the notorious 1973 sterilization of Minnie LaRalph. She was a 14-year-old Black girl in Mississippi who was first administered Depo-Provera and was subsequently surgically sterilized after social workers noticed that boys were hanging around her house and feared Minnie might become pregnant while her family received benefits. Because these procedures, which Ralph and her impoverished and illiterate parents were not fully informed of, had been paid for with federal funds, President Nixon hurriedly banned the use of such funds for the sterilization of minors. And the informed consent guidelines that we consider standard today were established. Now, while Blacks' intrinsic worth as citizens were denied control over their body, their utility as subjects in medical experimentation has long been exploited. And I want to draw your attention to this Time magazine cover. This is April 2002. And the image is of a white woman in a jar. And it's how, and the cover image was, how medical testing has turned millions of us into human guinea pigs. And the picture is supposed to be immediately evocative, right? That we don't want to imagine ourselves as guinea pigs. We don't want to see ourselves in cages subject to testing. And yet, Black Americans, the protections, the idea of how they're treated, this notion wasn't applied to them historically. And they've been subject to extensive and unethical treatment within the medical industry. And there are some really notorious examples. So let's talk about the Tuskegee Experiment, officially called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The federal government oversaw an experiment in which about 400 Black men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated so doctors could study the disease. And this began in 1932, when the US Public Health Service recruited 662 poor rural sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama. And just in case you think, oh, you know, it was innocent, they had syphilis already, let's talk a bit about the details of that study and imagine, could it be done today? The participants, and in this image is a doctor drawing blood, participants were informed that they would receive treatment for bad blood, and at the time, that was another name for syphilis, and free healthcare if they consented to the study. And as of 1955, it was recorded that 30% of the participants in the study had died as a result of the study. And when penicillin was made available as an option for treating syphilis, it was denied to participants who were in the study. And the study continued until 1972. It spanned the period of Jim Crow into the civil rights movement. These sharecroppers were lied to and recruited because they were seen as expendable, right? This was a part of and foundational to the study. Let's talk about Hela cells. So Hela cells are the world's first immortal cell line to live indefinitely outside of the body, and it's foundational to the expansion of biomedical research. And Hela cells enabled the creation of the polio vaccine. So foundational, no question, right? Incredibly important. The challenge is when we talk about the Hela cells, we forget the person. And Hela cells are a product of Henrietta Wax, a Black rural tobacco farmer from Virginia. Cells from her cancerous tumor within her cervix were cut out months before she died from cervical cancer in 1951, without her consent or her knowledge. And this, about 18 years after the start of the syphilis study, Johns Hopkins University used these cells without her knowledge or consent, and her cells were seen as remarkable and prolific, but not worthy of consent. In many ways, that she had no idea, and nor did the family. And that's been the subject of movies and lots of discussion since. Those are just two examples, but Black bodies and their body parts have been repeatedly used indiscriminately to find cures for diseases and vaccinations, which has led to the success of the biomedical industry. And as I'm approaching the end, I want to highlight an award-winning book that shares the title of my closing, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty by Dorothy Roberts. That while value and disdain are subjective, the treatment of Black patients is an objective indicator of the value placed on Black life. Doctors and related professionals reflect the society in which they live, and despite an oath to do no harm, did so intentionally and lied about it. Blacks were viewed as expendable, explicitly devalued, and deemed not worthy of being consulted for consent, informed of risk, and more. And deep suspicion as a result still characterizes the engagement of Blacks with the medical establishment today. We can see that in a couple of ways. The Pew Study earlier this year did a study, a sample in April 20th and May of 2020. And they found, not surprisingly, that Black adults have less positive views of medical scientists than Hispanic and white adults. And if you just look at the data for a moment, the first question is asked, do they have a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public? Blacks were at 35%, whites were at 43%, and Hispanics were at 45%. Next question, do they have a mostly positive view of medical research scientists? Blacks were at 53%, right? The average was 66%. The next question was, do you have a mostly positive view of medical doctors? 61% for Blacks compared to 75% for whites. So big gaps that are consequential as we think right now about the fight against COVID-19 or any number of medical ails that require engagement with the medical community. I want to take you to Asia for a moment to talk about the consequences. Sometimes it's helpful to look outside of your immediate context. And so this paper, this image is called the vicious circle. The consequences of patient and physician mistrust in China. And this was a special issue of the journal Developing World Bioethics. But the image is really insightful. And if you start at the base of patient and physician mistrust, the base of that octagon, and they talk about it as a crisis of two things, a crisis of values on one end and a crisis of institutions, and those bidirectional arrows feeding those that mistrust. And then if you focus in the octagon for a moment, the patient's mistrust moves in a particular direction. It leads patients to engage from a place of fear and self-protection, which leads to more workload and more difficulties in communication between the patients and the doctor. The outcome of that is poorer healthcare outcomes and patient discontent. The outcome of that is medical disputes and conflicts and what's experienced as medical violence. The outcome of that is negative media coverage, which then feeds into more patient and physician mistrust. Again, it's not the American context, but I would argue, and I think many would agree, it absolutely reflects the tensions that are on the ground as it pertains to Blacks' engagement with the medical establishment today. It is one of the things that underlies the disparities that we're seeing in the impact of COVID-19 on the Black community. And with that, I want to take you back to W.E.B. Du Bois. And another quote, a more fuller quote that he uses in The Souls of Black Folks, in which he says, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be the problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town,' or 'I fought at Mechanicsville,' or 'Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil?' And at these I smile or am interested or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word." And that, again, written in 1903. And if we apply the 2020 version to that, the examples would be a bit different, right? Which is, my best friends are Black. I know lots of really wonderful Black people. I attended a Black Lives Matter march. Aren't you angry about all of the police brutality? Those questions are relevant, but they're missing the deeper underlying contradiction, which is, does the systematic racial inequality that shapes the life experience of Black Americans bother you? And in the case of myself, as a Black American woman, how does it feel to be the problem? How does it feel to be framed and experienced as the problem? So many of the studies about emergency care right now, a quick read of Twitter, will talk about the experience of being read, whether or not your pain is recognized. Those are real challenges that come back foundationally to being the problem. And changing the culture in medicine, that tension of mistrust, comes down to us understanding the broader difficulties about being Black in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Branch. It was wonderful talk, and I'm so glad that we had a chance to have you here with us as our inaugural speaker for our anti-racism speaker series. And yes, I know you can't hear it, but we're all clapping. And it's just, I'm just so excited and like just invigorated because it's just a wonderful kickoff and segue into Dr. Vivian Taylor's office is putting together, she's having a talk by Dr. Tatum tomorrow, and we're
Wonderful.
Yes, and we're talking about the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?
Yes.
So it gets to the question that you just asked in your last slide, where you talk about, you know, how W.E.B. Du Bois's quote on not asking the question or out of delicacy, whereas in her book now, she talks about, you know, white fragility.
Yeah.
So, so I'm very interested to talk about all of these topics some more. I wish we had even more time, but I will be happy to take, you know, questions. We can, if you have questions, anyone from who is in attendance, please feel free to put it in the chat.
Absolutely.
And we can ask Dr. Branch any questions you have.
So excited to take some questions, and while they're coming on, one of the things I love about that book and the way that it moves the conversation away from a deficit model. I was teaching a race class years ago to undergrads, and I had a student ask a similar question, you know, well, I went to a high school that was racially mixed and all the Black kids sat together, and I said to him, who did you sit with at lunch? He's like, well, what do you mean? And I said, who did you sit with at lunch? You noticed that all the Black kids sat together. Who did you sit with? And this is a white male, and he said, I sat with my friends. And I said, and who do you think the Black kids sat with? And for him, the question, the other side of that question just never, the assumption was they all sat together because they were Black, whereas he sat with his friends.
Absolutely. It's a different, they have a different context or perception when it's yourself versus other people. So
and the extension of that to medical care, right? Which is, what does it mean to be the other and to be othered in that interaction, right? When it's, how can I get the help that I need when I am othered in the interaction?
absolutely. I think you made a very good point too, while we're waiting for questions, about the Tuskegee experiments and Hela Cells and all these other atrocities and mistrust among the Black community and healthcare.
Yeah.
What's going on in the world today with COVID-19 and the development of vaccines, and how some schools of, particularly some HBCUs, have been partnering with with vaccine development and testing.
Yep.
Do you have any thoughts about, and being a graduate of a HBCU, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, you know, it's complicated, right? Particularly in this moment right now, because we have a tension between what happens when we're not represented, right? So if I think on, if you go to the flip side, and I'll draw my womanness in this moment. One of the things we know about research on heart health is that so often they don't include women. So some of the treatments that come out, some of the outcomes are impacted, some of the scales on medication, some of the dosages are like, you didn't actually plan with me in mind. You don't know its impact for me, right? And that has a particular consequences. So there's an outcome to the lack of representation. The challenge with vaccines and anything that's untested is when you're a part of that initial, we don't know what will happen as a result of this sample, right? There's a new level of risk. And in my ideal world, I want that risk to be distributed. I don't only want those that are vulnerable to be subject to risk. And I think the thing about the syphilis experiment and the way that it was contorted, and if we just, the thing about, you know, the present is always an unfair judge of history, right? But there's this idea that we have novelly, that we would never do anything like that today, right? It's like, well, let's not just talk about what's happening in America. We have just outsourced risk globally, right? A lot of the vaccine trials are happening in places like India, right? And some of it's happening, whether we're talking about it or not, probably in Africa, right? And so these are really complicated notions. What I want is the ability for there to be some sort of self-advocacy. And so I'm in New Jersey right now, and there were trials that were started or wanted to be started in New Jersey. And there was active conversations in Newark involving both the community members and the School of Public Health about being informed as to the risk of participation. So I want there to be that level of transparency, the ability for there to be research. We know there needs to be research, but let's not treat participants and Black communities in a give me kind of model, right? Like, we need your body participation, but what does it mean to treat them with respect, to allow a level of autonomy and provide sufficient understanding to enable agency, right? To be able to actively consent, not just sign this paper with no understanding. That's what's critically important. And so as long as HBCUs are partnering at ethos in mind, then we're in a good place. But the questions are about the pressures and how fully that's being carried out and substituted.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, when I think about it, I think about it from, of course, a genomics standpoint, and thinking about not only the risk, but also precision health. So, you know, coming from similarly the frame of mind where you're looking at, we need to include as many people from as many backgrounds as possible so that we can make the best decisions based on as much information as we can. We can't just isolate it to certain in certain groups in certain places, geographic areas. In order for us to truly be effective in the treatment of COVID, and we know that minority populations have been at greater risk, how are we gonna do that if we're not including all of society? Because all of society has been afflicted by it.
Exactly.
So it's the same, I think it's the same argument with precision health and including more minorities in genomic studies. I think we need to include all of society in COVID studies so that we can provide the best care.
I think there's a question came in and I want to answer in relation to what she just said. So I'll read it out. Dr. Branch, excellent presentation. There have been a few articles asking that we move from using the example of Tuskegee and Henrietta Wax to reference to reference the mistrust people feel, what examples would you use? And I want to actually start with COVID, and then I'll give you some other examples. Because one of the things that I have been following with real interest, and sadness is the only word I can offer, is how often the inadequate level of care is germane and underlying the disparate impact on the Black and Latinx community, right? So we're not even talking about the illness itself. We're not talking about the impact on the body. We're not talking about comorbidity. We're talking about care. So there was the instance of the teacher in New York who went to 3 different hospitals and was denied testing and ultimately died from COVID earlier on. This was like April and May. But there were several cases in which people tried to go to the ER and were turned away when they arrived, where their symptoms were dismissed and minimized. Oh, you just have a cold. Oh, and the stories around that started to become so commonplace, right, that it became much more of a kind of public conversation of, well, we know we have to take this seriously, but what do you do when you say, I'm experiencing something, and the place that you go to for help, right? If the hospital is minimizing your concern. And one of the things I said a lot to folks to think about, the impact of mistrust, is it was heightened in the COVID pandemic. Again, I'm in New York, I'm in New Jersey, from New York, and you guys are mostly based in New York. In places like New York or New Jersey, where the virus is really intense in the spring months, which meant that hospitals shut down and you were unable to attend with a loved one. The impact of mistrust that I want to focus on is there was no one there in the instance when loved ones were in facilities to ensure the quality of their care. So the impact of the distrust was different, right? When you felt like, well, was someone asking that second question? Was someone saying, oh no, they really are in pain and are they getting the support that they need? That was a second layer, a heightened level of angst for people of color, Blacks in particular, who were thinking about loved ones dying alone, right? Being in the hospital alone. That's the impact of mistrust, right? And so that's the first layer of mistrust as a story, because there wasn't immediately a level of trust. I'm putting my loved one in care and someone's going to make the best decision. But particularly what happened in COVID, which was a new thing for American society to even imagine, is have to moderate who gets care, who will we choose, right? When there isn't enough facilities, right? When there's not enough ICU beds, are we confident that the older Black grandmother was going to be cared for adequately? And there were stories after story after story in which people talked about that pain, right? Of getting dressed up to go to the ER so they'd be taken more seriously. That's the impact of mistrust. So it's not just the more extreme cases, if you will, of Henrietta Wax and the Tuskegee Experiment, but it's the implications for on-site care in real time for how that conversation happens. There's another story recently where someone talked about going to the hospital and they put on their university sweatshirt and hat because they knew that it was going to start a conversation about them as a valued person, right? They were going to ask, well, why are you wearing that sweatshirt? Those kinds of signaling and micro interactions have everything to do. What does my shirt have to do with the quality of healthcare I receive? I mean, this happened to me. I would take my daughter to the ER and I said something and I referenced someone and I was wearing flip-flops and a sundress. I'd come from the beach. No titles, no pretense, right? And I had asked for something and one of the ER docs actually looked me up online and confirmed I was who I was. What did that have to do with the care for my child, right? Mistrust, mistrust, mistrust. And so concrete examples in terms of things like pain, right? That the treatment of pain, the belief that Blacks experience pain is something that lots of studies have cited as a real challenge in place of inequity. All right, I've got another question. Given the level of conversation today about Black Lives Matter, from individuals who have not had that conversations in the past, do you think that this is a moment when minds and hearts can accept and advocate for the value of Black lives? Yes and no. I'm going to start with the no. I'm going to start with the kind of provocative no, which is, the challenge of American society, in my view, in terms of scholarship, student of history, and at present, it's a byproduct of what we see in the election right now. It's not necessarily that there is an argument of should we value Black life. The conversation and the response to Black Lives Matter was all lives matter or blue lives matter. And the proponent, the introduction of the phrase Black Lives Matter was never to say no other lives matter, right? It was to say, hey, this particular group is experiencing harm. Let's reassert their value as a response. The feedback, the blowback, if you will, is about the no, right? Because it's even when it would seem obvious, even when you explain away, that's the motivation for saying Black Lives Matter. It's not about saying other lives don't matter, but we want to reaffirm in the face of violence, these lives matter. That is met with the response as consistently as it is, that, well, no, it's all lives matter, or let's talk about something else. That's the no, because I don't think the story, the American story has been one of we're not sure, or it was an accident that we made the case that Black lives don't matter. You know, lynchings, if I go all the way back in my good historical bucket, were public events. People showed up and watched like it was a television show. The treatment of Black life and the devaluing of Black life was active. And so what I mean by that is it wasn't just a passive. And so to the extent that the devaluing of Black life is active and the affirmation of others that Black lives don't matter is active, it's not just that this moment is going to be different, right? We've been here before, and I think that's the challenge. So that's my no. But I think it's a yes too, because the other thing that I think is happening now is we have this brief post-racial flirtation, I'll call it, in which people are like, oh, things are great now. We're not having really the kinds of challenges we've had before. Look, you know, we've got a Black president and a Black wife and like all the things, America solved its problems and yay. And so many people wanted that to be true, right? It wasn't just naive, it was genuine. People wanted that to be true. And the moment of retrenchment that we're in, that has began in 2008 and has continued ever since, is making a lot of people who thought we had solved our race problem, they're forced to see that we haven't. And for some people, that's forcing a level of dissonance, right? They're seeing their country in a way they've never seen it before. And they're like, I don't recognize this. I thought progress was linear. I thought we were gonna just keep getting better. I thought that, you know, people were gonna be judged by the content of their character. I thought we were getting to that place. In the last 12 years, you can really see in a way you might not have been, or you might have been able to take for granted before then, that that's not true. So I think the clarity, that the difficulty that we're having as society right now gives me both hope and it makes the challenge really clear. All right, I got a couple more. Let's see. So let me see. So several studies have shown that Black patients who have Black providers often have better healthcare outcomes when compared to Black patients with white providers. On one hand, we want the best for our patients. And if that translates to Black patients being seen by Black providers, we're inclined to think that we should do that. The other side of this makes me believe that it will not rectify the problem at hand, and the problem will be perpetuated as a result. What are my thoughts, opinions, suggestions on how to work through this? Great question. I want to take you to the world of education as an example. So one of the things that people talk about, big study of research, because research or education as a field is also lopsided. K through 12 public education in particular, in most large cities, is largely Black and brown. In New Jersey, it's already Black and brown. In New York City's public school system, it's already Black and brown. Whereas the teaching labor force is predominantly white and heavily women, right? 80 to 90% at levels. And some of the research has shown similar trends, right? Black students are more successful when they have Black teachers, or Black students are more likely to be identified as gifted when they have Black teachers. So what do we do with this problem, right? That race matching allows for optimized outcomes. It's not just a matter of create more race matching, but it's what is it about the race matching that's enabling the better outcomes? How do we really get at that? And in the education realm, great book by a woman named Lisa Delpit that's called Other People's Children, where she talks about the outcome and what underlies the race match, which is a level of trust, an ability to see and understand yourself that enables you to help a student succeed or to see their potential. The same is true in medicine. There's a great book called Flatlining about how race and gender shape health by Adia Harvey Wingfield. And she talks about this looking at focusing on Black providers. And she looks at nurses and doctors and physician's assistants and talks about what's happening in this, the race matching. And one of the things she includes in that book is the conversations that Black doctors and physician's assistants and nurses overhear their white peers having and the consequences. So it's not just simply about race matching, but one of the things that comes out of her research in those conversations is they see the devaluing in real time. They see the minimization of Black pain. They see the discounting of the symptoms that patients can offer. So what are some ways, and here, if I offer technology as a whole, right, that we can manage the distrust on the front end? Right, so before the provider walks into the room, for instance, what if there was a way for you to catalog your symptoms and have them recorded, right? And so that they're reacting to it as opposed to reacting to the person that they see, right? What are some ways that we can think about this creatively to create more equity in outcomes? But someone referenced in the chat whistling Vivaldi, right? And the way that our stereotypes about others shape our immediate interactions. When I teach, I talk to my students about, the way that we pick bananas, right? And if I draw on the African diaspora plantains, what you think is a good plantain varies definitely depending on where you're from, whether it should be yellow, whether it should be black, whether it should be spotted, right? That we all get, immediately the idea of stereotypes. We miss the consequences. And I think it's important for us to heighten in medical training the difference. We shouldn't go through our training processes. You shouldn't leave medical school or nursing school with this idea that all it is about is the science. The disparities that we experience and the understanding of what's underneath them shouldn't just be about Henrietta Wax and Tuskegee Experiment, because then you do think that was then and we're all better now, right? But you actually need some kind of foundational training. The upside of COVID, I hope, is that we are going to, in this next generation of medical care, be forced to confront this inequity and be forced, I hope, to think about what is it going to take for us to be better on the other end of this.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic kickoff to our anti-racism speaker series. We're just so thrilled to have you all here. And Dr. Branch, just so you know, we have people from all over, not just Columbia University.
Oh, awesome.
Of course, we have our illustrious students and faculty and wonderful people from across the university, but we also have visitors here from University of Virginia, the NIH, University of Texas. So people from all over have tuned in to hear your talk, and I'm sure they are very happy that they did. And we're so glad that you were able to spend time talking with us today on all these, important conversations. And as I mentioned before, students, if you would like to receive a copy of Dr. Branch's book, please let us know. We also will invite all of you to, we have 2 more speakers. We will have 3 speakers a year in our anti-racism speaker series for the Center for Research on People of Color. On February 25th, we will have Dr. Amadou Gay, who will talk to us from, he will speak to us about his categorizing racial, social disadvantage in research studies. And in particular, he is interested in cardiovascular disease and will talk to us from the Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health. In April, we will have Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith, and she will talk to us about health disparities among the people in the Eastern Caribbean and her ECORN cohort. She is she has a new title, the Associate Dean of Health Equity Research at Yale School of Medicine. So thank you again so much for tuning in with us, and it's been a pleasure to have you all here. If you have any questions for Dr. Branch after, please let me know and we can get those to her. And we will also send you a short SurveyMonkey evaluation after. Thank you again, Dr. Branch, for your time and your presentation. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Awesome.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.